Chapter 10 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Long Swim. Antigua, one of the Leeward Islands, is noted for the number and excellence of its harbours, the chief of which is called English Harbour. Here in 1838 HMS Seringapatam was lying at anchor, and one August afternoon a number of her officers decided to take a cruise in the pinnace, and everything seemed to promise them a pleasant excursion. Favoured by a gentle breeze, they sailed to Falmouth Bay, about 2 miles distant, and after spending a short time there, set out to return to the ship. By this time the wind had fallen, and the pinnace lay as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Forgetful of the changes which are so common in tropical latitudes, the sailors took no precautions against a sudden squall, and the result was that before they knew exactly what had happened, they found themselves in the water. Fortunately, the boat went over so gradually that everyone had time to creep to windward and seat himself on the gunwale. Strange to say, not one of the party had a knife, so that it was quite impossible to cut away the rigging and right the boat. The sails, however, being set, protected them in some measure from the breaking of the sea. Their position was one of extreme peril. Not a sail was in sight, they were fully 2 miles from the shore, and the current would soon drift them farther out to sea. A storm might arise and wash them off the wreck. More terrible than all else, they were in waters infested by sharks, and if attacked by these, their fate was sealed, for the boat's gunwale was only 6 inches above water. In silent despair they awaited the end. Suddenly a young midshipman named Smith declared his intention of swimming ashore. His companions looked at him in alarm. Had the prospect of a lingering death turned his brain? Was the thought that passed through their minds. The very mention of such a thing was a sign of madness. 2 miles was a long distance to swim in any case, but especially where there was every likelihood of being attacked by sharks. In reply to the remonstrances of his comrades, Smith said, "It's our only chance. I'll take the risk, and if one of you will accompany me, I think I can manage it." "Well," replied Palmer, another midshipman, "I'm not much of a swimmer, but it's in a good cause, and I'll go with you as far as I can." Braver words than these have seldom been spoken, even by an Englishman. Without further delay, jackets and shoes were thrown off, and the 2 noble fellows, bidding farewell to their comrades, struck out for the shore. Smith was the stronger of the 2, but what Palmer lacked in strength he made up for in pluck. As Smith swam along he felt something strike his legs, and looking down through the clear water, he saw to his horror 2 enormous sharks swimming past. It was indeed fortunate that they had not noticed the 2 youths, a circumstance which is accounted for by the fact that they did not strip. With marvellous presence of mind, Smith kept the knowledge to himself, for fear that the near presence of their dreaded enemy might completely unnerve his already exhausted friend. Half the distance had been covered when Palmer exclaimed, "Go on, Smith, I'm quite used up." "Never," replied the plucky middy. "Rest on me for a minute, but don't cease striking out." As soon as Palmer seemed to have regained his strength, they again made for the shore, but they had not gone far when he once more urged Smith to go on without him. All this time the sharks were distinctly visible, and Smith, fearing that if they did not keep their limbs moving the monsters would attack them, again urged his companion to cheer up and keep striking out while he supported him. Nerved by the thought of his shipmates' danger on the wreck, Palmer summoned all his strength for another effort. But the shore was yet a long way off, and more than once he felt faint and weary, and would have given up but for Smith, who cheered him on, and by his hopeful manner infused fresh energy into his stiffening limbs. At last, after a swim of 2 hours, Smith touched the bottom, and with a joyful shout seized his companion by the hand and dragged him through the shallow water on to the beach. Thoroughly exhausted, Palmer fell on the sand, where he lay for some time unable to move. Meanwhile Smith was running hither and thither, spreading the alarm, and soon all the inhabitants of the nearest village, men, women and children, flocked to the beach. 2 boats were manned with as little delay as possible, and launched to the rescue. A messenger was also sent to the ship with the news of the disaster. Darkness came on very rapidly, and to add to the difficulty of the search, a terrible storm broke over them. The rain fell in torrents. Sharp and vivid flashes of lightning burst through the thick black clouds, and the white-topped waves looked hideous in the gloom. The boats took different directions, but hour after hour passed, and no sign of the wreck was perceived. Hope gave place to fear, and fear to despondency. Still the searchers persevered. This way and that they rowed, but no answering shout replied to their calls, and they were ready to mourn their comrades as dead. Meanwhile several boats had been sent out from the Seringapatam, one of which, under the command of the gunner, fell in with the boat in charge of Smith. Following the drift of the current, they proceeded for some distance, and in a short time sighted the wreck, 6 miles from the spot where the accident had happened. With anxious hearts they rowed towards it. Their ringing cheer was feebly responded to as they got alongside. "Where are the others?" asked Smith, for of the 9 he had left, only 5 remained. "Trying to swim ashore," was the brief reply. Fortunately they had only been gone 5 minutes, but in a sea infested with sharks a great deal may happen in even a less period of time. Pulling, therefore, with all speed in the direction indicated, Smith found the 4 men, each of whom was lashed to an oar, endeavouring to make their way to the shore. When the last man was rescued it was past 9 o'clock, making it nearly 5 hours that the poor fellows had clung to the boat. During the storm their sufferings had been terrible, for they expected to be washed off every moment. To complete the horror of their situation, a large shark appeared on the scene and watched their every movement, ready at the first chance to make them his prey. As time went on, they concluded that Smith and Palmer had perished, and when they knew that their rescue had been effected solely by the gallantry of the 2 midshipmen, their delight knew no bounds. A few months later the whole ship's company was mustered on the main deck of the Seringapatam, and Captain Leith, calling the 2 midshipmen forward, presented each of them with the silver medal of the Royal Humane Society. About 10 years afterwards the heroic Smith was a lieutenant on board HMS Endymion. While the ship was lying at anchor off Vera Cruz, the second mate slipped from the gangway and fell into the sea. In his descent he struck his head against the ship's side. Instantly the cry, "A man overboard!" was raised, and Lieutenant Smith and several other officers rushed on deck. The night was very dark, and at first nothing could be seen, but at length something white was noticed floating some distance from the vessel. Smith dived and swam in the direction of the object, which, when he reached it, he found to be the missing man, quite motionless on the water. Smith at once raised his head and supported him in his arms until a boat came and picked them up. As they approached the ship, the sailors crowded the rigging, and in the excitement of the moment another man fell into the water. Not knowing if he could swim, Smith instantly plunged to his assistance, but found on reaching him that he was perfectly able to take care of himself. For this second display of gallantry, Lieutenant Smith received a second silver medal from the Royal Humane Society. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Amid storm and darkness. The residents spend their lives in a primitive and unambitious manner. Such is the description we have of the people of Newfoundland, and in no other part of the world can a hardier race of men be found. Their kindness and hospitality to strangers is a marked feature of their character, and indeed they are worthy descendants of those fearless men who laid the foundation of our vast colonial empire, for Newfoundland is England's oldest colony, a fact of which that island is justly proud. From the ocean the island has a wild and rock-bound appearance, but on a nearer view the line of cliffs is seen to be broken by magnificent bays, many of which stretch inland for about 100 miles. From the water's edge the shores of several of these bays are clothed with green dark forests, which give the country a striking and picturesque aspect. The fisheries on the coast of Newfoundland constitute the chief industry of the island, and since the discovery of America by Cabot in 1497 they have been a great source of wealth. The chief fishing ground is towards the south east, on what is called the Great Bank of Newfoundland, a huge sandbank nearly 300 miles in length. Here large quantities of cod are caught every year, and form an important article of food on the island, the annual consumption amounting to about 8 million fish. The seal fishery also gives work to a large number of people. Owing to the fogs which shroud the coast from time to time, wrecks are of frequent occurrence, and the cliffs, between 200 and 300 feet high, afford but little chance of life to the shipwrecked mariner. Many stories of rescue might be told of this island, but there are none which surpass in grandeur that which we are now about to narrate. On the night of the 29th of November, 1875, a man named Langmead, who lived at the north of Pouch Cove, a fishing village a few miles from St. John's, was aroused from sleep by cries for help, which seemed to come from persons near his house. Lighting a lamp, and partially dressing himself, he opened the door and looked out. To his surprise, he saw two men, wet to the skin and well nigh exhausted, leaning against the wall. In reply to his question, "What do you want here?" one of the men told a pitiful story. He said that he was the captain of a schooner which had left St. John's a few hours before with a crew of 24 men. For a time all had gone well, but suddenly a gale sprang up, accompanied by a blinding snowstorm, and in trying to enter an adjacent cove, the vessel had been driven on the rocks. The moment that she struck, he jumped from the bridge onto a ledge of rock, and his example was followed by two of the sailors. Many were drowned, but the remainder of the crew had succeeded in obtaining a footing on another ledge. Their cries for help were more than the captain could endure, so he determined to go in search of assistance. Accompanied by one of the sailors, he began the ascent of the cliff, and after a perilous climb they reached the summit and set out across the snow-covered fields in the hope of finding some habitation. The barking of a dog had led them to Pouch Cove, and they begged for food and shelter for themselves and speedy help for their shipmates. Without loss of time a substantial meal was set before them, and then Langmead set out to alarm the village. In a few minutes most of the inhabitants on the north side of Pouch Cove were up, and many prepared to start for the scene of the disaster with ropes and other tackle, which they thought would prove useful. There is a deep and narrow inlet of gulch about 1.5 miles to the north east of Pouch Cove, well named the Horrid Gulch. On the south side of this inlet the rocks run up almost perpendicularly to a height of 600 feet, and against them in stormy weather the long Atlantic rollers dash with tremendous force. On a shelving rock near the foot of the cliff lay the survivors. On the north side the cliff is less precipitous, and rises in a succession of ledges, onto one of which the three men had jumped. The party of rescuers started from the village about 1 o'clock in the morning, and quickly reached the north side of the gulch. There they found the man who had been left behind, and having rescued him, they crossed over to the southern side to try and find the whereabouts of the unfortunate crew. Above the thunder of the waves came the cries of the poor fellows calling for aid, but the darkness was so intense and the snowdrifts so blinding that it was impossible to see their position. The men on the cliff raised a shout of encouragement to let them know that relief would soon be afforded them, but while they shouted, every mind was anxiously trying to devise some plan of rescue, and many were their misgivings. At length they decided that the only way possible was by lowering a man over the cliff by a rope. This was a feat not unattended with danger, even during the day, but on such a night it seemed certain death. Who was there bold enough to take the risk? A few moments passed in painful silence. Then a fisherman named Alfred Moores volunteered to make the attempt. A strong rope was accordingly fastened round him, and he was lowered over the precipice. Owing to the overhanging nature of the cliff, he found it impossible to proceed, and shouted to be drawn up. 3 times was the brave fellow swung into the darkness, and as often drawn up baffled. A 4th time he was lowered, and half swinging, half sliding along a steep crevasse in the rock, he succeeded in reaching a ledge immediately over that from whence the cries proceeded. Guided and supported by his rope, Other brave fellows now followed him, and took up a position between him and the top of the cliff, so as to be in readiness should their assistance be required. At the top, with the end of the rope round a tree, was William Langmead. To form any idea of the pluck of these men, you must picture to yourself their position on that bleak cliff side, in the darkness and cold, clinging for dear life to a rope, the length of which, from the top to where Alfred Moore stood with the end round his body, was 85 fathoms. Peering through the darkness, Moores could just distinguish several poor creatures huddled together on a rock about 100 feet below. Twice he threw down a hand line, but the nerveless hands of the sufferers failed to grasp it. A third cast proved successful, and then a stronger rope was passed down and made fast round the body of one of the sailors. Moores hauled him up to the ledge on which he stood. There the rope was untied and passed down again, while the rescued man, helped along by those on the crevasse, and supporting himself by the rope to which they were clinging, reached the top in safety. In this way the 9 survivors were rescued, thanks to the courage and skill of Alfred Moores and his brave companions. For his active benevolence, Moores was awarded the Silver Medal of the Royal Humane Society. 12 years later, another brave Newfoundlander received a similar reward for conspicuous bravery. During a dense fog, a ship named the Octavia ran aground on a dangerous reef at Burnt Head. The lives of those on board were in great peril, when Philip Cow, an assistant lighthouse keeper, hailed them from the cliff and told them to heave a line ashore. A rope was thrown and made fast by Cow, who, after removing some of the heavier portions of his clothing, fastened a line round his body and swam out through the surf to the vessel, which was lying about 20 yards from the shore. 2 men were brought safely to land. Then, after a brief rest, Cow then made the same perilous journey backwards and forwards 7 times, till he had rescued the 9 men who composed the crew of the Octavia. Shortly after the captain had been brought ashore, the ship broke up. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. An Australian Grace Darling. In December 1876, the steamer Georgette was on a voyage from Fremantle to Adelaide. The vessel sprang a leak, and the captain ran her ashore on a part of the surf-bound coast of South Australia. The ship's lifeboat was in a damaged condition, and the 8 persons who tried to reach the land in it were drowned. This left the passengers and crew, numbering in all nearly 50 persons, without any means of escape but a ship's boat, which could hardly live in such a sea. The vessel was grounded on a part of the coast where no harbour existed, and not a single human dwelling could be seen. Even if the men were able to swim ashore, the women and children would all be lost. The captain resolved to try the boat, for he knew that the ship might go to pieces at any moment, and then the last chance for life would be gone. So the boat was launched, and some women and children were lowered into the frail vessel. Before it reached the shore it capsized, and the passengers were all thrown into the water. While they were clinging on to the boat, a young girl appeared on horseback, on the top of the steep cliff which bounded the beach. This was Grace Bussell, the daughter of a settler who had made his home on the bank of the Margaret River, halfway between Cape Naturalist and Cape Lewin. She was out riding in the bush, accompanied by a native servant, when she appeared on the scene. Without a moment's hesitation she rode fearlessly down the steep cliff, followed by her attendant, and at once urged her horse into the boiling surf. The spray dashed over her and drenched her to the skin, but she boldly made her way to the overturned boat, and managed to lift some of the children on to the back of her horse. Others clung to her skirt and to the saddle flaps and girths, and then she made her way to the shore and placed those she had rescued out of the reach of the waves. No sooner was this done than the brave girl again turned her horse seawards. Her work was but begun, and she feared that her strength would fail her in the terrible struggle with the fierce, tumultuous waves. Again she reached the boat, and the good horse struggled back through the foaming breakers with its human load. When she had saved all those who had been thrown into the water by the upsetting of the boat, she turned her attention to those who remained on board the ship, and, assisted by her native servant, she at length succeeded in bringing every one of the crew and passengers safely ashore. 4 hours had been spent in this work, and now the rescued persons were in danger of perishing from hunger and cold. Half naked, wet through and shivering, they crouched on the beach in a pitiable condition. Grace knew that, unless help was speedily obtained, the work she had already done would be of no avail, so she again mounted her horse and rode off home as fast as she could. She had a journey of 12 miles to go, and when she arrived she was so exhausted that she could scarcely tell the story of the wreck and rescue. When the circumstances were explained, a supply of provisions and a quantity of blankets were at once conveyed to the sufferers, and they made themselves as comfortable as possible for the night. On the following morning the farmer conveyed the whole party to his house and paid them every attention until they could be taken to the nearest town. For this noble act Grace Bussell and her native attendant each received the silver medal of the Royal Humane Society. Writing of the event, the Bishop of the diocese says: "Strange to say, she and her family just think that all they did was the most natural thing in the world." End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Southend Hero. Those who have visited Southend-on-Sea are probably familiar with the story of William Charles Bradley, who, for many years, held the position of pierhead keeper. Born in 1850 at Southend, it was only natural that he should develop a fondness for the sea, but we should hardly have expected that he would learn to swim at such an early age that he retains no impression of the first attempts. To use his own words, "I cannot remember the time when I could not swim." After leaving school at the age of 13, he spent the next few years in learning the business of a waterman, and took part in several of those rescues, involving more or less risk, which have caused Southend boatmen to boast that "in the memory of man not a death has occurred among their patrons while in their charge." In 1870 he took possession of "the shanty" at the head of the pier. During the summer this abode is all that can be desired, but in winter it is dreary in the extreme, and, as not unfrequently happens, highly dangerous. During a terrific gale which swept over the east coast several years ago, great seas broke over the pier, and it was feared that the keeper's wooden house would not outlast the fury of the storm. Considerable anxiety was therefore felt on shore for the safety of Bradley and his wife and family. A number of men accordingly volunteered to go down with the trolley and bring back the mother and her children. They had not gone far when a vessel, that had drifted from its moorings, crashed into the pier, smashing the piles and making a large gap in the flooring, thus completely cutting off their retreat. Still they went on to the pier head and brought away the family. Then came the question of how to get across to the shore end of the pier. Fortunately the tide had fallen considerably by this time, and the party were enabled to return to the shore in a boat. Bradley's life-saving record is 27 lives in less than 18 years, but it is impossible to give particulars of most of these, for he does not even know the names of some of those he rescued. As he recently told the author, "I cannot remember all I have saved one way and another, for men that belong to the water are always fishing someone out." His first rescue happened in 1871, when a boy fell from the north east side of the pier head, and, for his services on this occasion, he received £half from the lad's mother. In the following year he had rather a strange experience, the story of which we will tell as nearly as possible in his own words. "I jumped into the water after a lad, who had fallen off the top railing which runs from end to end of the pier. I managed to get the boy, but, being some distance from any landing place, I supported myself and the lad by clinging to one of the piles of the pier. A boat came along, with 3 London lads in it, and they stopped and looked at me, but it was not until after a lot of persuasion that I got them to take the boy and me in. When I asked them why they didn't come before, they said they were afraid I should turn the boat over." In 1873 a boy fell from the pier when the tide was running out fast, and Bradley jumped in and got hold of him. Then came the tug of war. All his efforts to swim back were thrown away, owing to the strength of the current, and it seemed as if 2 lives were to be lost. Someone threw him a rope, and in trying to reach it he sank a long way down. A second attempt was more successful, and he hung on until a boat was lowered from a passing steamer, and they were rescued from their perilous position. Bradley gained the bronze medal of the Royal Humane Society in July 1882. 3 boys fell from the end of the pier into the water. One got hold of the woodwork, and by climbing regained the pier. The second was picked up by a boat, but the third was carried away by the current. Bradley jumped into the water, and after a stiff swim against a rapidly running tide, reached the boy. Being unable to make his way back, he supported him for 10 minutes till a boat came to his assistance. When picked up, Bradley was at the last gasp, and if help had not come when it did, the lives of both would in all probability have been lost. It may be remembered that about 12 years ago considerable excitement was caused by the publication of a report that a Spanish lady, who had been saved from drowning at Southend, had left a fortune to her rescuer. It was afterwards learned that the story was without the slightest foundation, and that the time at which the event was said to have taken place was the same day on which a little girl named Florence Hawkins was pushed by some means or other into the water. The tide was at its height, and there was a heavy swell on. Bradley jumped in without any hesitation and grasped the child, but it was only after great difficulty that he succeeded in bringing her ashore. It is supposed that someone who witnessed the rescue of the little girl from a passing steamer was the author of the hoax. Instead of a fortune, the gallant pier keeper received the Society's bronze clasp. A second clasp was awarded to Bradley in 1888 for saving the life of a lad of 15, who had fallen overboard from the steamship Arran, which was lying alongside the pier. At the time of the occurrence, Bradley was checking the number of passengers embarking and disembarking. Suddenly there came a cry: "Bradley, a boy overboard! Bradley, a boy overboard!" Instantly, without waiting to strip himself of a single article of clothing, Bradley left the gangway, ran along the deck, and from a height of 16 feet dived into the sea. When he reached the lad, he was on the point of sinking for the last time, and before his rescuer could get hold of him he had sunk several feet below the surface. Supporting the half unconscious youth in his arms, Bradley swam back to the pier. His kindness, however, did not end here. He had the lad carried to his house, where he received every attention, nor was he allowed to go home till his clothes had been thoroughly dried. Exactly 4 weeks later to the very day, an accident happened which, but for Bradley's prompt assistance, might have ended fatally. The steamship Clacton, having been caught in a fog, called at the pier to land her passengers, and before she could get away the Arran also arrived and was moored alongside. To reach the movable landing stage, the passengers of the Arran had to cross the deck of the Clacton. Before everything was in readiness, a man under the influence of liquor tried to rush across. Twice the sailors pushed him back, but he made a third attempt, succeeded in passing the men, and got on to the landing stage, which was held to by the pier rope. As the stage was not firmly grounded, it slipped, and the rope guided it in such a way that it threw the man a distance of about 12 feet into the water, between the Clacton and the pier. He came to the surface feet first, and as he showed no signs of righting himself, Bradley went to his assistance. Having lifted his head out of the water, he passed a rope round his body and he was hoisted on board, while Bradley, amid the ringing cheers of the passengers, swam to the pier. The rescued man was attended to on board the Clacton, and soon recovered from the effects of his ducking. Meeting his rescuer as he went along the pier, he shook hands with him and thanked him heartily for having saved his life. In recognition of the bravery displayed by Bradley on this occasion, the Society awarded him the Silver Medal. One of the most stirring incidents in the career of this daring man happened on an Easter Monday a few years ago. A young man named Humphreys fell between the pier and a steamer just as she was on the point of starting. His position was one of the greatest peril, for he was in danger of being crushed against the piles or drawn under the boat to certain death, and the same danger threatened anyone who went to his rescue. But Bradley, who had already risked his life under similar conditions, fearlessly plunged into the water. With great skill he caught hold of the drowning man, and bore him out of the reach of the undertow, and landed him in safety. Besides wearing the silver and bronze medals of the Royal Humane Society, Bradley has also been awarded the silver medal of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, a decoration which he won under such exceptional circumstances that we cannot refrain from giving a brief account of the occurrence. At 11 o'clock on the night of the 11th of November 1887, two sailors, returning to their ship, were thrown into the water by the capsizing of the boat. A gentleman, who witnessed the occurrence, gave the alarm, shouting, "Bradley! Bradley! 2 men overboard!" The pier keeper, who was in bed at the time, heard the cry, and at once rushed out into the cold raw night with no other clothing on except his shirt. Throwing a lifebuoy to the nearest man, he lowered a boat to go to the rescue of the other. After a search of more than an hour, he found the poor fellow about a mile away, clinging to the bottom of the boat. To the honour of Southend be it said that she has not neglected her hero. Some time ago the town presented him with a handsome clock and bronzes costing £12, together with a purse of £50, in recognition of the many acts of heroism he has performed. Virtue is its own reward, and to such a man as Bradley, who to day wishes, as he told me, that he had done more, the consciousness of having acted a brave man's part in saving the lives of his perishing fellow creatures must be his chief satisfaction. Nevertheless, the knowledge that his efforts have been appreciated by the great life-saving institutions of the land, and by his own townsmen, must be gratifying in the highest degree. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Life for a Life. It has been said that if a list was made of the accidents which have taken place in England during the last 50 years, it would be found that a greater number have happened in workshops and factories than either on sea or land, above the earth or under the earth. Few people think what a host of dangers beset the workers in our large industrial centres, and when the news of some fatality reaches us, we are too apt to attribute the occurrence to carelessness, and to fortify our conclusion with the well-worn saying, "Familiarity breeds contempt." Those who work in iron foundries run many risks over which they have no control. Not the least of these is occasioned by the noxious fumes which are thrown off by the molten metal in the process of manufacture. First the ore is put into a blast furnace, with layers of coal and limestone to remove the earthy matters and impurities. As the ore melts, it runs down to the bottom part of the furnace. Through a hole the molten metal is run off into sand moulds on the floor, where it cools and becomes pig or cast iron. In this state it is very brittle and cannot be hammered. The "pigs" are next put into a cupola furnace to burn out the impurities which still remain and to render it fit to be hammered or rolled into plates. The cupola furnace is built of fire bricks embedded in fine clay, so that it can withstand the great heat to which it is subjected. On the 21st of September 1883 the workmen of Deansgate Foundry, Bolton, had lighted the fire in the bottom of the cupola furnace, and were busily engaged filling it up with pig iron, when some of the bricks were accidentally displaced. Owing to the great heat required to melt the pigs, it was necessary that the damage should be made good without delay. One of the men, named Thomas Howarth, undertook to repair the breach. He had almost finished his task when he was overpowered by the sulphurous fumes of the heating metal, and fell insensible to the bottom of the cupola. His companions, knowing well that death by suffocation was only a question of a few minutes, stood staring at each other, the picture of helpless horror. The news of the occurrence soon spread through the foundry, and reached the ears of William Brimelow, the son of the proprietor, a man known as a quiet, home-loving fellow, who liked to listen rather than to talk. Few, if any, of his friends suspected that he was a man made for some great emergency, but such indeed was the case, as the result proved. Without a moment's delay he rushed to the spot, and before anyone could prevent him, he had disappeared through the narrow opening which was used for charging the furnace. His fellow workmen lamented what they considered his rash action, and thought sadly that 2 homes would now be desolate instead of one. A ladder stood against the perpendicular side of the cupola, and down this Brimelow quickly made his way to the spot where his comrade was lying. Though Howarth was a heavy man, Brimelow did not pause to consider his weight, but, seizing hold of him, carried him to the foot of the ladder. The real difficulty of the rescue now became apparent. To ascend a perpendicular ladder is, even under the most favourable conditions, no easy task. To do so carrying the insensible form of a man weighing nearly 13 stone amounts almost to an impossibility. Considerations of this kind no doubt passed through Brimelow's mind as he struggled to raise the heavy burden in his arms. Holding Howarth against his chest with his right arm, thus leaving his left free, he began the ascent. Slowly and painfully he toiled towards the opening. The strain on the muscles of his chest and shoulders was fearful, and the wonder is that he held on. In denser volume rose the poisonous vapours. His breath came in short and painful gasps. Resolutely he battled against the fast increasing weakness which assailed him. Would he ever reach the top? The whole occurrence only occupied a few minutes, which, however, seemed like hours to the anxious watchers at the side of the cupola. At last Brimelow's arm was seen in the opening, and willing hands quickly relieved him of his burden, and assisted him off the ladder. By this time Howarth was to all appearance dead, but the rescuer's work was not yet accomplished. Though himself sorely in need of attention, he set about restoring animation to his comrade, and at length his doubly gallant efforts were rewarded. Slowly but surely Howarth revived, and was little the worse for his terrible experience. Brimelow, however, was not equally fortunate. The fumes had penetrated to every part of his system, and that, together with the terrible physical strain, inflicted injuries from which he has never recovered. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friend. This is practically what Brimelow did, for since the day that he performed what has aptly been described as one of the most heroic feats of modern times, he has not known what life really is. Months of weakness succeeded long days of pain, and the occasion which found him a hero left him an invalid. His gallant conduct was brought before the Royal Humane Society, and that institution awarded him the silver medal he so richly deserved. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On thin ice. The sensation of falling into open water is as nothing compared with that experienced in breaking through ice. The feeling of utter collapse and undefinable dread which comes suddenly when that which a moment before seemed a firm footing gives way, and precipitates the skater into icy cold water, is enough to paralyse the mental and physical powers of the strongest. In open water, even a person who cannot swim has a chance of life, but in breaking through ice, an experienced swimmer has often no chance of escape. In summer, hardly a day passes without its record of bathing or boating accidents, and in winter skating is scarcely less fatal. In this chapter we propose to give a few instances of bravery displayed in connection with ice accidents, for which the silver medal of the Royal Humane Society has been awarded. Several years ago, two sisters named Coates were skating with a gentleman named Lewis on Loch Derg in County Galway, Ireland. This loch, which is an expansion of the Shannon, is 24 miles long, with an average width of 2 miles. When the skaters were about 100 yards from the shore, the ice gave way under Miss Coates, who was some distance in advance of her companions. As the water at the place where the accident happened was 12 feet deep, Mr. Lewis at once made an attempt to rescue the girl from her perilous position, but in doing so he approached too near the broken part, and also fell into the water. With some difficulty he managed to scramble out on to the surface, and started for the shore to obtain a rope. Jenny Coates then threw the branch of a tree to her sister, which materially assisted her in keeping her head above water. She also took off her boots, that she might retain a firmer footing on the ice. In a few minutes Mr. Lewis returned with a rope, and cautiously approached the hole. He was about to throw it when the ice again gave way, and he sank beneath the surface, never to rise again. In that awful moment Jenny did not for an instant lose her presence of mind. Seizing the rope which Mr. Lewis had dropped on the ice, she succeeded, after several attempts, in passing it to her sister. The brave girl had not sufficient strength to drag her sister onto the surface, and for nearly 2 hours the girls remained in this terrible predicament, Jenny meanwhile crying for help till she was hoarse. At length their younger brother appeared on the scene. When he saw the state of affairs, he rushed off and quickly returned with another rope. Jenny then handed the rope to which her sister was clinging to her brother, and with the other she crept on hands and knees to the hole. Stooping over the edge, she tied the rope tightly round her sister's waist. Then, crawling back to the firm ice, she assisted her brother in dragging the almost lifeless girl out of the water, and carrying her to the shore. When the committee of the Royal Humane Society awarded the silver medal to Miss Jenny Coates, they unanimously agreed that the courageous conduct of the late Mr. Lewis should be placed on record, for had he survived his gallant attempt at rescue, he too would have received a silver medal. The next rescue is certainly unique, if not unparalleled in the annals of life saving. Two young men, named Smith and Dennison, were skating on a piece of water near Penrith, when they broke through the ice in different places, and became immersed in 20 feet of water, about 200 yards from the bank. Hearing their cries, two brothers, named Joseph and Frederick Whiteside, went to their rescue with all speed. Joseph fastened a piece of stout cord to a stick, and crept with this in his hands towards the hole where Smith was evidently drowning. When he got near enough to bring his apparatus to work, the ice broke under him, and he also became immersed. In desperation, Smith seized his would-be rescuer by the throat, and with the mad instinct of self-preservation, fastened his legs round him. Thus pinioned, Joseph was helpless, and the two men went under several times. They would both in all probability have been drowned, had not Frederick Whiteside thrown off his coat and waistcoat and plunged into the hole. After a desperate struggle, he succeeded in freeing his brother, and then he devoted all his energies to saving Smith, a feat which he eventually accomplished. Joseph was by this time much exhausted, but he managed to keep afloat until his brother came to his assistance and rescued him. Frederick then turned his attention to Dennison, who was still struggling in deep water. Skating up to the hole, he cleverly placed the stick in the drowning man's hands, and drew him out without further mishap. It ought to be a source of great gratification for us to know that an institution like the Royal Humane Society is in existence to acknowledge such acts of heroism. On the 2nd of February 1880, Adam Lachlan, a student of Boniface College, broke through the ice while skating on Lake Shearwater in Wiltshire. As often happens, he was carried under the ice, and was in immediate danger of drowning. Another skater, named Cunningham, at once determined to make an attempt to save the unfortunate fellow. Encumbered as he was with clothes and skates, he plunged without hesitation into the hole. Swimming under the ice, he seized hold of the unconscious student and succeeded in bringing him to the open space where both were drawn out of the water in safety. For this plucky and dangerous action, Mr. Henry Ward Cunningham received the silver medal. Another rescue, under exceptional circumstances, was performed on the 4th of January 1893. A gentleman named Patchell was skating with a party of ladies on Simmons Lake, Dungannon, Ireland, when the ice gave way and he was thrown into the water, which at that part was about 20 feet deep. Fortunately, he did not lose his presence of mind, and, though he was carried under the ice, he struggled to break his way through, and after repeated efforts finally succeeded. On coming to the surface, he was, however, unable to do more than keep his head above water, for every time he attempted to assist himself by putting his weight on the ice, it gave way, and he frequently sank. Finding that he was wasting his strength, he made up his mind to wait calmly till help arrived. One of the ladies, Miss Margaret Long, courageously skated up to the edge of the hole, threw herself flat on the ice, and, after undoing her cloak, handed one end of it to Mr. Patchell, while she kept hold of the other, and thus held him above water. Her position was extremely perilous, owing to the treacherous nature of the ice, which was thin and rotten. Though almost covered by the overflow of the water on the ice surface, she held on for some time, till the arrival of two men named Smith and Hart, by whose help Patchell was finally rescued. The silver medal was awarded to Miss Long, and bronze medals to Smith and Hart. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A notable feat. The last decade has furnished many names to the fast lengthening list of heroes, far too many, indeed, for us to attempt to give here anything like a representative selection. Let us, therefore, take one signal instance of courage and fortitude. It belongs to the year 1900. The incident occurred at sea. Here is the story according to the official version. On the 18th of September, while Her Majesty's ship, Empress of India, was entering the Douro Channel, Cape Fassa, Isle of Andros, a steamer was observed firing signals of distress, and on nearer approach, about 10:45 p.m., was found to be anchored off a lee shore and riding by a hawser only. She proved to be the steamship Charkitch of London, bound from Piraeus to Constantinople, commanded by an Austrian with a crew of 40 to 50 hands, and carrying upwards of 30 passengers. Lieutenant Lowry communicated with the ship in the cutter, and learning that the shaft was broken, asked the captain what he could do for him, and whether he wished his crew taken off. The captain asked for a hawser to take him in tow, but by the time the cutter had returned with it, the ship had drifted too close to the shore for this plan to be feasible. Immediately afterwards she disappeared from view. It was evident by the sudden extinction of the lights that she had taken ground. All effort to find the vessel by searchlight proved useless, and as the wind and sea made it impossible to search the coast with boats, the Empress of India stood off at 12:50 a.m. until daybreak, when the masts of the Charkitch were seen standing out of the water. 3 men were on the foremast, and 3 others on detached rocks close to the wreck. A heavy sea was running, with a cross current, and much wreckage was about. Lieutenant Lowry at once went in the cutter, and endeavoured under oars to float a line and lifebuoy to the foremast to windward of the wreck. He failed, owing to the cross current, but one man swam from the mast to the buoy, and was hauled into the boat. Having tried again for some time to get the buoy to the mast, with no success, and the men seeming unable to move, Lieutenant Lowry jumped overboard about 7 a.m. and swam to the wreck with a lifebuoy and line. As he reached the rigging, he lost the line, which fouled some wreckage, and he was cut off. Throughout the forenoon efforts were made to establish communication with the wreck. The cutter first made another attempt, but was struck by a heavy sea and half filled with water. Both sea boats were then sent in with oil to be thrown on the water, rockets and grass lines, but all in vain. The Empress of India then proceeded to Pago Bay and landed a party to try and reach the wreck from the shore. On her return it was found that the back of the wreck was broken. One of the men had got ashore on a large piece of wreckage. Lieutenant Lowry, with the other man, was still in the fore-rigging, which might now give way at any moment. His own lifebelt would possibly have enabled him to reach the shore, but he would not leave his companion, who had none. Another attempt was made about 3 p.m., both by the shore party and by Lieutenant Vereker in the cutter, to reach the wreck. Lieutenant Lowry directed the cutter from the mast of the wreck, and succeeded at last in throwing a line into her. With the aid of this the rescue was accomplished, Lieutenant Lowry assisting the last man into the boat before leaving the wreck. Meanwhile, one of the 3 men on the detached rocks managed to reach the shore. The others were washed off and drowned. The Royal Humane Society awarded Lieutenant Lowry their silver medal, and at the close of the year he was selected to receive the Stanhope Gold Medal for the bravest deed of the year. Lieutenant Lowry had already rescued a number of persons from drowning at different times, and on this last occasion he was in the water for more than 8 hours. Our readers will learn with regret that the gallant officer, who was a son of Major General Lowry, by his repeated immersions seriously undermined his constitution. Symptoms of consumption appeared, and although every effort was made to save his life, it was of no avail. He returned from Davos Platz in Switzerland, whither he had been ordered by his medical advisers, only to die. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Heroes of Recent Years. Early on the morning of the 15th of March 1900, a man named MacLeod went into a tar still at Sunderland to make some repairs. In doing so, he acted contrary to instructions, for the still had not yet cooled from recent use, and the deadly gaseous fumes it contained had not had time to evaporate. Hardly had he entered than he was overcome and fell a distance of nearly 9 feet to the bottom of the tank. Richard Lawson, another workman, heedless of the danger, promptly went to the rescue, but he too was overpowered, and a like fate befell John Weddell, who ventured to follow him. With courage unshaken, William Allen next essayed the perilous descent. Tying a rope round his waist, he entered the tank. In safety he reached the bottom and brought out MacLeod, and a second venture resulted in the rescue of Weddell. A third time he entered, and was in the very act of putting the rope round Lawson when he felt himself being overcome. In haste he fastened the rope round the unconscious man and staggered to the opening, which he reached just as his senses were going. When an attempt was made to haul Lawson out, it was found impossible to move him. Something had gone wrong. There was but one way of putting things to right, and but one man to do it, and so for the 4th time Allen braved the danger he knew so well. When he got down, a glance was sufficient to show him what was amiss. Lawson's feet had got entangled in some machinery at the bottom of the still. In a moment Allen had set him free, and he was pulled out. All the men suffered greatly from the effects of the poisonous fumes, but in time they recovered. For his heroic bravery in entering the still 4 times, knowing well the risk he ran in so doing, Allen received the Stanhope Medal. Bronze medals were also awarded to Weddell and Lawson for their plucky and praiseworthy efforts. An exploit, no less remarkable for heroic disregard of self, distinguishes the Stanhope winner for 1902. It was in the Bay of Biscay that the SS City of Corinth encountered a tremendous hurricane. Shortly after 8 o'clock on the morning of the 1st of February, when the storm was at its height, a French brig was sighted in distress. She was labouring heavily, and the steamer steered towards her to offer assistance. When she was still half a mile off, the brig suddenly went down. With the faint hope of picking up any survivors, the steamer circled round the spot where the brig disappeared. Soon the eager crew were rewarded with a sight that filled them at once with hope and dread. Clinging to some floating wreckage could be seen the figure of a man, tossed hither and thither by the angry waves. Lifebelts and ropes were thrown towards him, but he seemed too exhausted to avail himself of any means of deliverance. To lower a boat meant only a useless sacrifice of life, for it would have been promptly knocked to splinters against the ship's side. Yet it did not seem possible to abandon the poor fellow to his fate without at least some effort at rescue. In this emergency, when the natural fear of each man was struggling with his courage, Alexander C. Henderson, the third officer of the steamer, tied a line round his waist and went over the side. Then followed an unequal contest between man and his unmastered servant, the sea. Several times the officer got quite near the distressed mariner, but as often a huge wave would cause the ship to lurch and he was dragged away. Again and again was the contest renewed. At one time he would be high on the summit of a wave, at the next deep down in the trough of the sea. At one moment he would be almost within hand grasp of the man, the next he was swept back the way he had come. Once indeed a mighty breaker pressed him backwards and swept him in fury right under his own ship. Not even then did he think of giving up, never once did he slacken. As often as he was swept backwards, so often did he breast his way forward again, till at length his heroic persistence and dauntless endurance had their reward. He reached the castaway. In a moment he whipped the lifeline round the now inanimate figure, and together they were hauled on board. The rescued man was the sole survivor, and how desperate his state was when saved may be judged from the fact that he did not recover consciousness for 5 hours. It is a far cry from the Bay to the coast of China, but thither we must go in search of our next Stanhope hero. The P&O steamship Malacca was lying at anchor off Woesung, China, when the quartermaster, A. Aveston, in attempting to go down a bamboo ladder, fell into the sea between the ship and a lighter that was lying alongside. It was the night of the 13th of December 1902, dark and bitterly cold, with the temperature below freezing point. There was a strong ebb tide running, and it would have gone badly with Aveston had not J. Shearmey, the fourth officer, seen the accident. He at once jumped into the sea, fully clothed as he was, and laid hold of the quartermaster. All danger was not yet over, for in addition to the icy coldness of the water, the boats were bumping heavily, and it seemed that if they were not drowned they stood a good chance of being crushed to death. Fortunately the alarm had been given, and after a few minutes, which seemed like ages, a rope was thrown over the side and they were hauled on board. The spirit of daring that must animate a man, even in full health and conscious of his strength, who leaps into the sea from a fast-going steamer to the rescue of an imperilled fellow creature, is unquestionably great. Heroic indeed is the courage of him who, with health shattered and strength undermined by insidious disease, ventures a like hazard. An instance of this now claims our attention. The SS Saghalien was in the Ionian Sea on a voyage from Mauritius to Marseille, when an apprentice accidentally fell from the ship. The cry, "Man overboard!" roused one of the passengers, Captain Thomas C. Mackenzie, of the Royal Army Medical Corps, who was on his way home, invalided after a severe attack of pneumonia and typhoid fever. Without a moment's hesitation, and heedless of the great risk he ran from the speed at which the vessel was steaming, he jumped overboard. A lifebuoy was thrown after him, but it fell short. He, however, secured it, and struck out again. He reached the struggling youth, who, though able to swim, was in difficulty owing to his waist belt having become twisted round his legs. The captain quickly freed him, and with the belt lashed him to another buoy which had drifted near. Then, tying this buoy to his own, they awaited help from the ship. It happened, however, that owing to the rough sea they had been lost sight of by those on board, and it was not till 40 minutes after that they were again seen. Then, without loss of time, a boat was lowered and they were picked up. Captain Mackenzie subsequently received the Stanhope Medal, and to emphasise how well deserving he was of so high an honour, it may be mentioned that when he had embarked 3 weeks before the occurrence, he was so ill that he had to be carried on board. The next award which comes under our notice was for an act of splendid gallantry. On the morning of the 6th of March 1905, a number of men were going to work in a sewer at Warrington. The first man to go down was Frank Donahue. On reaching the bottom, which was about 7 feet below the street level, he was overcome by the foul gas and fell unconscious. Another workman, named Bretherton, at once went down to try and rescue him, but he was driven back and had to be helped, half fainting, out of the manhole. John Mitchell next tried to descend, but he got no further than a foot of the ladder before he was overpowered and rendered unconscious. A similar fate overtook James Baxter, who followed. At this moment John Stockton, a baker's carter, appeared on the scene, and hearing from those around what had happened, he pluckily volunteered to go down. He had never been in a sewer in his life, and had not even a remote idea of the surroundings. But that mattered nothing to him in this moment of need. He was not the man to stand agape when life was at stake. He could but try, he said. so into the noisome opening he went, but he was back again almost in a moment. The gas had been too much for him, and he had to come up for air. He had not, however, any thought of giving up his self-imposed task, and in a few minutes he went down again, rope in hand. This time he succeeded in reaching the bottom. The first man he came across was Baxter, round whom he quickly passed the rope, and ascended with him to the street. A third and a fourth time Stockton went down, and succeeded in bringing the bodies of the other two men to the surface. Artificial respiration was at once resorted to and persisted in till at length Mitchell and O'Donoghue were brought back to life, but Baxter was beyond human help. The deed for which this highly prized decoration was awarded in 1906 was performed in the Mediterranean. The cruiser Leviathan was in the Gulf of Lyons when, on the night of the 12th of March, a sailor named Mulligan was swept overboard from one of the gangways. It was nearly dark at the time, and the sea was rough. The accident was seen by Sub-Lieutenant Dolores J.D. Noble, who, without an instant's hesitation, dived from the quarter-deck and struck out for the fast drowning man. Unfortunately, before help could reach him, the poor fellow sank, and so tempestuous were the waves that Noble himself nearly lost his life. He was only just able to reach a lifebuoy, and was hauled on board exhausted. A "Son of the Sea" again won the Stanhope Medal for 1907. On the evening of the 13th of September, the SS Ilovo was at anchor in the Inhambane River, East Africa, when a boat containing James Moore, A.B., and some 30 natives, was swamped by the heavy sea. Frantic in their terror of the sharks, even more perhaps than of drowning, the men clutched Moore and dragged him under water. From the deck of the ship, a young seaman named William Henry Parr saw the struggle, and knowing what must be the fate of his messmate if help were not speedily rendered, he jumped overboard and swam to the rescue. It was no easy task to free Moore from the splashing, struggling mass of humanity that clung about him, but it was at length accomplished, and Parr swam away with his unconscious burden beyond the reach of the frenzied natives. Meanwhile, a boat had been lowered, and eventually the two men were picked up half a mile from the ship. Here for the present ends our record of Stanhope medalists, men whose bravery has led them on the instant to the verge of destruction that they might snatch a fellow creature from death. Greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friend. What then must be said of him who falters not to hazard his life for a stranger? Peace has her heroes as well as war, and it is well for us, not merely as individuals, but as a nation, that there is in our midst an institution such as the Royal Humane Society to bring the deeds of our everyday heroes before the eyes of all, and to honour them by an award of such significance as the Stanhope Gold Medal. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A visit to the receiving house. It is a well-known fact that the operations of the Royal Humane Society are neither understood nor appreciated as they ought to be by the vast majority of people. Many regard the institution as simply a medal dispensary, and they are utterly ignorant of its real nature. A visit to the receiving house in Hyde Park would open the eyes of the public to the scope and value of the work carried on, for there the society can be seen, as it were, in its working dress. The receiving house is situated on the north bank of the Serpentine, and contains, besides accommodation for the resident superintendent and boatman, 2 wards, a surgery, and a committee room. The wards are furnished with 2 baths and 7 beds, which can be heated with hot water. The object of this is to keep up the temperature of the body after the removal of the patient from the warm bath to the bed. There are also 2 hollow iron tables, with pipes leading to a boiler, through which the hot water circulates. By this means the hot water bottles, etc., are kept constantly warm and the rooms at a high degree of temperature. Throughout the year about 2 tons of water are kept constantly hot, and a warm bath can be obtained at any hour of the day or night. The wards and everything in them are models of neatness and cleanliness. The red and white bed quilts in the one, and the blue and white in the other, give the rooms a pleasing and almost a cheerful aspect. Warm dressing gowns of grey flannel lie ready on the tables, and all that is wanting to complete the picture is a case. On the wall hang the cork jackets and sou'westers of the Society's icemen, and by the side of each a lifeline is suspended. In a cabinet in the committee room there is a grand array of life-saving appliances, past and present, including models of ice boats, rafts to be used in the event of shipwreck, lifebelts, lifelines, folding ladders, etc. Among the number there is one lifeline which is especially worthy of notice. It consists simply of 2 circular pieces of wood, connected in the centre by a stout metal pin. Round this a length of strong canvas tape is wound until it is nearly flush with the edge of the wood. To the end of the tape a metal ring is fastened. The whole thing can be carried in the pocket without any inconvenience, being about the same size as a surveyor's tape measure. Should anyone break through the ice, the benefit of this invention becomes apparent. The iceman passes the ring over his thumb and rolls the drum in the direction of the immersed person, who seizes it. The tape is sufficiently strong to support the weight till further assistance can be rendered. If necessary, a rope can be attached to the ring, which the immersed person pulls towards him, and can then be drawn to firmer ice. It would be well if such an appliance was in the possession of every skater. Here the visitor may see the apparatus which was formerly used, for the double purpose of inflating the lungs and injecting tobacco smoke, with a view to restoring suspended animation. It consists of a pair of bellows, several pieces of flexible tubing of various lengths, a brass box, enclosed in wood, to hold the heated tobacco, and a curved silver pipe for inflating the lungs by passing it down the throat. In this connection it may be interesting to give a brief outline of the method recommended by the Royal Humane Society for restoring the apparently dead, and in use at the present time. The points to be aimed at are, first and immediately, the restoration of breathing, and secondly, after breathing is restored, the promotion of warmth and circulation. These efforts must be persevered in until the arrival of medical assistance, or until the pulse and breathing have ceased for an hour. The rules to be observed are as follows. To adjust the patient's position, place him on his back on a flat surface, inclined a little from the feet upwards. Raise and support the head and shoulders on a small firm cushion or folded article of dress, placed under the shoulder blades. Remove all tight clothing from about the neck and chest. To maintain a free entrance of air into the windpipe, cleanse the mouth and nostrils, open the mouth, pull forward the patient's tongue and keep it so. An elastic band over the tongue and under the chin will answer this purpose. To imitate the movements of breathing, place yourself at the head of the patient. Grasp his arms, raise them upwards by the sides of his head, stretch them steadily but gently upwards for 2 seconds. This induces inspiration, and by this means fresh air is drawn into the lungs by raising the ribs. Immediately turn down the patient's arms and press them firmly but gently downwards against the sides of his chest for 2 seconds. By this means foul air is expelled from the lungs. These movements must be continued 15 times in a minute until a spontaneous effort to respire be perceived. During the employment of the above method, excite the nostrils with snuff or smelling salts, or tickle the throat with a feather. Rub the chest and face briskly, and dash cold and hot water alternately on them. Friction of the limbs and body with dry flannel or cloths should be had recourse to. When there is proof of returning respiration, the individual may be placed in a warm bath, the movements of the arms above described being continued until respiration is fully restored. Raise the body in 20 seconds to a sitting position. Dash cold water against the chest and face, and pass ammonia under the nose. Should a galvanic apparatus be at hand, apply the sponges to the region of the diaphragm and heart. When a spontaneous effort to respire is perceived, cease to imitate the movements of breathing and proceed to induce circulation and warmth, thus: wrap the patient in dry blankets and rub the limbs upward energetically. Promote the warmth of the body by hot flannels, bottles or bladders of hot water, heated bricks to the pit of the stomach, the armpits, and to the soles of the feet. On the restoration of life, when the power of swallowing has returned, a teaspoonful of warm water, small quantities of wine, warm brandy and water or coffee should be given. The patient should be kept in bed, and a disposition to sleep encouraged. Large mustard plasters to the chest and below the shoulders will greatly relieve the distressed breathing. In all cases of prolonged immersion in cold water, when breathing continues, a warm bath should be employed to restore the temperature. Opposite the receiving house there is an enclosure where the 3 boats are kept, in which the Society's men patrol the waters of the Serpentine during the bathing hours morning and evening. When we remember that 200,000 persons bathe in the river every summer, it is marvellous that so few fatalities occur, a state of affairs for which we have to thank the Royal Humane Society and its energetic men. At the rear of the house there is a large building, where are kept the ice boats and other appliances by means of which the Society provides for the safety of more than 100,000 skaters. The boats are exactly like stout sea boats, and have great breadth of beam. That they may be pushed over the ice steadily and quickly, runners are fastened on either side of the keel, and to protect them from damage by ragged edges of ice, they are sheathed in copper nearly to the gunwale. Here also, piled up in regular order, are the ladders, with which every skater is familiar, the stands marked dangerous, and the poles for railing round the pond when the ice is unsafe. The perfect order and arrangement which characterise every department of the receiving house reflect great credit on the superintendent in charge. The Society maintains life saving apparatus at nearly 300 places in and around the metropolis, and many lives are saved by the drags and lifebuoys. In winter and in summer the Society's men are constantly on the watch, and it is satisfactory to know that every care and precaution which experience and foresight can suggest are taken to prevent the ever-present risk of loss of life. End of chapter 18. End of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell.